Welcome to this topic video on React function components. We're going to be learning about React function components. Our readings are components and properties, lists and keys, which we've dealt with a little bit already. So, we've talked about JSX expressions. We said JSX expressions get turned, like this one here, eventually get turned into a JavaScript object. Hence, we can use them any place we would use a JavaScript object, which means we can return JSX expressions from functions. Okay, so here's an example. Welcome, blah blah blah. Okay, remember props name. We're okay. So we're going to be doing a substitution here. Now, here's an extra piece of React functionality. If your function begins with a capital letter and returns JSX, React interprets this as a component. What does that mean, Professor? That means these have a similar feel to HTML elements, but we get to define them. Okay? So we get to create. It's like creating our own custom HTML element. Now, we're not working with HTML, we're working with JSX, we're working with JavaScript extension, right? But it's going to feel that way, which is nice. Attributes, what look like attributes of our component, get fed to the function via props. Huh, Professor? Let's take a look. Okay, so let's go to our example directory, okay, our example Git repo actually, which comes as a zipped up, all in a zipped up file. And I'm going to make sure I'm on branch func component 1. Okay, now let's take a look and see what we have in here. We've got import React, our usual stuff, React DOM. Then I have this function. Starts with a capital letter, welcome, props, return, hello, props, name. Okay, so this is returning JSX. Now, let's see some usage. Or what we hope is usage. Here's a contents. It's a section. Now, we're calling this thing that looks like the name of the function, but it's in JSX type syntax. Okay, let's see if this will work. And first of all, this is JavaScript. It's JSX. So the syntax highlighting is starting slightly different. Okay, so how do we run these things? We're using our bundler, parcel as our bundler, so we say parcel. What is our index.html? And that's going to start that running. Now, where do we go look at it? We go look at it on the page presented by our development server. Okay, so let's open up a page. We'll put it hosting 234. Wow, Professor, you printed out 2 things. Okay, that's not the point. Okay, the point is it worked. What's the point of that, Professor? We were able to create something that looked like an HTML component. Okay, so that's a nice feel. Okay, we're able to pass information into it for use in rendering. Okay, we're able to use that thing multiple times. Oh, well, that's actually useful. Now, what's even more useful, okay, is the fact that React is so popular, there are extensions for your browser, okay, to show you for development tools, for your browser development tools, so you can take a look at what's going on. Now, this is actually showing me the components on this React page. Okay, here I can see welcome up here, and it was passed a prop called web development. Ah, here's another version of that component, and it was passed the property Dr. B name. Okay, so here are the props. All the props are passed as an object, right? And then we got the name, Dr. B, and we use that to render. Okay. Oops, I should have closed that. Okay, so here's a few comments. There is no welcome tag in HTML. This is our own component. Okay, and when we said welcome name equals web development, this name attribute gets sent into the component function as a field or a property in the props argument. Okay. The only thing that you should do is you should make sure you cheat the props argument as read only. Okay, in that function, now overwrite to them. That won't end happily. Okay, so we saw that rendering. Let's start putting this to use a bit. Okay, so a while back, I started writing a QUIZ-O-MATIC, a web app for students to test themselves on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay, I'm going to build this, or I did build this, in pieces from React components, testing each piece as we go. What I did is I started with a JSON file as our question pool. Okay, no database, no making, okay, no guessing at what things would look at. We started with some data that we wanted to render. Okay, so here's kind of what I came up with. Let's switch to our branch in our example repos. So let's shut that down for a sec. Okay, and we'll git check out. Okay. Now, what is this thing? If we look, take a look in our browser, our editor. Okay, what do we have? We've got questions.json. So this is an array of typical type of questions. Okay, question, which are the two non-semantic elements? Choices. Okay, so this is like a multiple choice question. Okay, there's a question part, there's a set of choices, and then there's a piece that tells you the answer. Okay, and this pattern repeats. Okay, so what I want to do is be able to make a quiz app. Okay, and that's my initial starting data. Okay, so first of all, the very first thing I want to do is just get things working a little bit. So I'm going to come up with a component for showing me the questions. Okay, the very simplest first thing I'm going to do is just have that component return, okay, assuming I'm passing it in, something called multi-choice question. I'm going to, multiple choice, I'm going to print out the question. Okay, let's see how this would get used. Now for fun, I decided to generate a random question. Okay, I have a little function to help me generate a random int, not shown here, or actually right here at the top. Okay, then after I choose that number, I use that to index the array, and look at this. Okay, so I go and get that question, random question. Okay, then I say multi-choice equals choice, mchoice. Okay, so I take one of those entries out of the array. It's got choices piece, a question piece, and an answer piece. All I'm going to do here right now initially is just render this one simple part of it. Just getting my component started. Okay, so I render that thing. I go QUIZ-O-MATIC, can JavaScript arrays change after size after creation? We all know the answer is yes. Okay, now let's take this up a notch. Let's create the list of choices, and let's do this in a nice component way. How am I going to create the list of choices? I've got, as we saw, I've got a bunch of choices in, okay, as a list here, okay? So there's the question part. The choices part is a JavaScript array, okay? And it's just text, okay? So what I'm going to do, okay, so I'm going to use the JavaScript array map function to generate an array of JSX list items, okay? Then I'm going to style that list a little bit to give me the usual ABC, okay, for enumerating the choices rather than 1, 2, 3 that you'd usually get for an ordered list, okay. Also, since we're working with arrays and lists, okay, we need to use that React key attribute. Keys are not IDs, okay, they only need to be unique within the array. This helps React render things much quicker. Okay. If you haven't used map before, then you haven't been working through the problems in this class. But recall, map is an array method. It takes a callback. The callback can receive 3 arguments. The current value of the item in the array, the index corresponding to that value, and the whole array itself. Okay. So here's how I'm going to generate the choices, okay? So assuming this is fed to the choices array, okay, I'm going to go list items equals choices map, okay? What am I going to return? I'm returning a JSX thing, okay? I'm going to wrap this stuff up in JSX and put it into an array of JSX. Since it's an array of JSX expressions, I got to use that key thing. But other than that, I'm just wrapping my content, my choice, with list item stuff. Okay. Then, I'm going to use some CSS styling. List style type. Notice the camel case here, because we can't use hyphens. Okay, on this side. Lower alpha. This side is okay because it's just string. Just a string, okay? So then we return, what are we returning? JSX expression. Function starts with a capital letter. We're returning a JS expression. This looks like a component. Yes. Let's go take a look. Where are we doing this? Index.js. Okay. Here we got that random math thing. Here we've got choices, okay? Takes an array of choices, okay, as a property item. Okay, it's going to produce those things. Oh, now question, it's going to get a question. It's going to show what the question is. I mean, it's going to get one of these full multi-choice question object thingies. It's going to show the question part, okay, in a paragraph. Then it's going to call the choices component. Professor? Yes. You're putting a component within a component. Yep. You're allowed to do that. You're composing things. Okay? Maybe we didn't decide to do this initially, but once it started getting kind of complicated in here, it's better to break things out into subcomponents. Why? Makes your code more readable. Okay? It's fairly clear that this part it has to do with the question, this thing has to do with the choices. Okay? Let's run this, see if it works, see what's going on here. Parcel, oh, up arrow. Let's go take a look over here, built in less than 2 seconds. Ooh. Now, look what's going on here. We've got a question component. It's being fed. Now this is going to make all that confusing stuff I was saying maybe a little clearer. Okay. Can you add properties to a JavaScript object after it's been created? Okay. So that is the question part. We see there is a set of choices, an array of 4 elements. Okay, that's fed into it. Okay. So this is to the question component. If we look down in the choices subcomponent within there, we see it's fed as properties just a set of choices, which it renders. Yes, never, only. Okay, depends on the JavaScript version. And the correct answer is yes. It's one of those things about JavaScript objects. Okay, so notice here, we even get a hierarchical view of the components, components containing components. Because you think this is going to get quite elaborate when we make elaborate user interfaces and web apps? You bet. This is going to get really complicated. You're going to have all sorts of stuff. This thing's going to be all the way down here. You're going to have all sorts of stuff on the page. But breaking it into components is going to make your life and the life of people working with you much, much nicer. Okay? So here we already used two components. Okay? So we updated the question component. Here was our structure. We had question stuff, choices. Okay? So it's the one thing about JavaScript. Remember, it's weakly typed. Okay? We've got this. We can have all sorts of structure within those objects. Okay? One of the things I always like to check, and that's what's nice about that properties view, is you can see what you've received in your component. When you're debugging, sometimes your problem is what your component is receiving isn't what it expected. Okay? We saw we can use components within components. Okay? And we got to see this render. Okay? My random number generator ensures that I get different questions each time. Just a neat trick so I can see that things are really rendering on the fly. Okay? Now, how do we get bigger? How do we get larger? Okay? How to grow? More components, more functionality in components. Things are going to get complicated, so we're going to move the components into their own files. Okay? This is where we start to take advantage of the fact that we really have a bundler. Okay? Now let me just quickly check out my other branch. Okay, git checkout 3. Okay. So now we're going to move the question stuff into its own module or file. Okay, big fancy name for a file. Okay, let's go with the brackets. Question.js. Import React from React. We need this not because we're doing anything direct rendering from here, but so that the system, the bundler, knows that we're doing stuff with React. It'll interpret what it sees as JSX and such. Okay? We saw our function choices, our questions. What's new here, Professor? It's sitting in a separate file, which is new here. Okay, that's all. So we're exporting. We're using one version of the export command to export the question class. And this is, in the case, we're using a default export. Okay, that's the main thing we're exporting. We have no reason to export choices because we're not using it separately. It's used by question, and the other people really don't need to use it. Okay, what's happening in our index.js then? At our index.js, we import the question. Okay, what am I doing here? That's a good question, Professor. What are you doing there? Okay, so I'm going to undate index.js. But instead of just showing a random question, I'm going to show all the questions. Let's look at them all. Well, that sounds really hard, Professor. Not really. Look at this. Questions. Remember, we've got the questions. What is it? It's an array. Map. Function. Each one of these is a multiple choice question. What am I going to do? Return. I'm going to create an array of JSX expressions. Each one of these is going to be a multiple choice question. So I'm going to display all my questions. That's why I'm calling this newly generated item, all Qs. I substitute this into contents. So instead of just looking at one of the questions, I'm going to look at all of them. Helps me find out if I have any bugs in my data or any bugs in my rendering thing to see if something doesn't render. Okay? So did I, forgot to start my bundler. Server running, built, quickly, reload. Now, look at all these different copies of the question. Each one contains choices. Okay. So we can see this component idea is going to pay off a lot. We're going to see applications are going to use tons of components. We're going to break things into separate files. And when our projects get even bigger, we can break our project into separate subdirectories, okay, and keep components, have directories of different types of components, okay. We're trying to keep things neat and tidy and organized so people can try and figure out what your code does and update it, okay. So this is the magic of React function components. We've got a lot more stuff we're going to be able to do with these, okay, but we're going to start off with just basic function components, and then we're going to bring in more powerful ideas coming up.